So this section 1.5, talking about bias and sampling, we dipped into last section when we were talking about sampling methods. The sources of bias and sampling have different vocabulary terms to talk about different kinds, but bias is talking about when we have results from a sample that are not representative of the entire population, which is why it's so important that we use correct sampling methods when we're trying to get a survey or get an experimental design done. We want to make sure our sample or the groups that we're using have the least amount of bias, so they actually represent the population. There's many ways we could have bias. Straight up, simply sampling bias means that the technique used to obtain the individuals in the sample tends to favor one part of the population over another. This will happen with convenience sampling, where sampling bias has some sort of undercoverage, so it doesn't cover part of the population, is incomplete in some way. The other ways you can have bias is not necessarily by sampling incorrectly, it gives you a wrong sample, but is what is called non-response bias. It's when individuals selected to be in the sample do not respond to the survey, and they would have different opinions than the ones who do. So maybe you chose a correct sample and you asked 100 of the correct sample size, but only like 75 of them turned it in, and happened to be that the 25 that did not respond were the ones who would have given you a completely different opinion. That's a non-response bias. Response bias themselves occurs when the questions on your survey or the answers that the respondent gives do not necessarily reflect their true feelings. And there's a number of ways that this could happen. You have your interviewer error. So if you're not asking the right kinds of questions, or you're like an aggressive interviewer, you're not going to get the same results as a trained or skilled interviewer. Misrepresented answers, so like it says in this example, if you ask people how many push-ups they can do and then be like, prove it, they're probably going to prove a different number than they said they could. That's a misrepresented answer. If you're just having people think about what they can do, may under or overestimate themselves. The wording and ordering of questions is important, as well as the type of question. It can be open-ended or closed, depending on what you want. And data entry error, like it says, that though it's not technically a result of response bias, a data entry error will lead to results that are not representative of the population. It's like, you gotta make sure you type your numbers in right, basically. Could be some way that we have some sort of bias. Now, it seems like these last definitions are just repeating what we have, but notice the word has changed from sampling bias to sampling error. So a sampling error and a non-sampling error are errors that we get from our samples, obviously. A non-sampling error is from undercoverage, non-response bias, response bias, or data entry. So they have nothing to do with you choosing the correct group. It has to do with actually getting the correct group to respond to you, typing in the correct information, all of that good stuff. Sampling error themselves comes from choosing the wrong population or part of a population to begin with. So if we don't use simple random sampling or stratified or systematic or cluster, we may have a sampling error in our survey. Are there any questions about all of these words you just read, all of this topic? That's basically it. We wanted to keep you aware of this biased and sampling to show why we spent time last class talking about all of those methods.